The Germans know an attack is coming. They know the Allies are going to land on in France, most likely France. There are suspicions they may land in Norway or whatever. But they know it's coming. They don't know exactly when, and they don't know exactly where. Now, in August of 1942, you had actually had a raid. It was primarily made up of Canadians and British, and I think there were a handful of Americans. They actually raided a coastal port city here of Dieppe. And the port of Dieppe, this raid launched in August of 42 at Dieppe, was intended to kind of be a rehearsal for an eventual cross-channel invasion. They wanted to see, the idea was they wanted to take this town, and they wanted to hold it against comebacks. And the more optimistic, more counterattacks, the more optimistic planners believed they could take Dieppe, maybe hold it for a considerable amount of time, maybe reinforce it, and that could be kind of our beachhead, right? Now, more realistic people said that's not a thing, but if they could take it, they could hold it for maybe a few days and then withdraw. That would be a victory in and of itself to show that that sort of thing could be done. The raid, however, was a disaster. The raid at Dieppe was a disaster with considerable Allied casualties. The Germans responded well. I mean, the Germans, of course, as we know, thoroughly professional soldiers, and they were able to take many prisoners there as a result of the Dieppe raid. By 1944, they had built up considerable defenses in any conceivable landing zone that the Allies might be able to make. They built tank traps, minefields, heavy fortifications at all these beaches where they could possibly land. And Germany kind of dubs these fortifications, pretty much from the Pyrenees in Spain all the way up to Norway. They dub these as, they call this the Atlantic Wall. The Atlantic Wall, or as it is also referred to as Fortress Europe. I think it was in early 44. Alfred Jodl gave a speech. Alfred Jodl was the chief of operations of the Wehrmacht. He gave a speech and he said, we've got a strong defensive line in Russia, and they're talking about defense in Russia by this point. We've got a strong defensive line in Russia. We got the Atlantic Wall in the west. He essentially called Europe Fortress Europa, Festung Europa, because it was, in theory, impregnable. What the Germans held was impregnable here. Now, the fortifications, however much the Germans are touting them, are spread very thin, and while they are real and they are dangerous, they are not nearly as powerful as the Germans are portraying them to be. Now, Erwin Rommel, whom we talked about before, Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, when Hitler takes him out of North Africa, right in early 1943, he briefly actually leads, I think he was in charge of an army group in Italy, very briefly, when the Allies first land. But then he shifted to France. And he was considered to be an expert in fighting, the Germans considered him to be an expert in fighting the Western powers, right, because he'd spent so much time in North Africa. So Erwin Rommel is going to be they're going to make him like the inspector of fortifications. And his job initially here is to inspect fortifications to make sure that they're going to meet, they can effectively meet any Allied landing. He reports on them, and he delivers a report to Hitler. His report to Hitler is very critical. It's very critical about the Germans' ability to hold off the Allies landing there. And so then Hitler will actually give Rommel a command there in France, and then we start to see kind of the real work of really building up forces here in early 1944, late 43, early 44, in really building up these things to a much greater extent here. So again, tank traps, minefields, heavy fortifications, big guns, big fixed guns at every major beach the Allies could use. Now, the Germans calculate, deduce that when the Allies come, most likely it will be somewhere in northern France. Most likely somewhere in northern France. But again, northern France is a pretty big place. Where? When? And, Hitler himself by early 1944, he's not the Hitler of 1940 or even 41, okay? Hitler's health is deteriorating. And critically, too, Hitler, and perhaps understandably, his priority is fixed on the East. The ideological struggle with Russia, right? This massive clash of arms in the East takes priority. Now, there are 228 German divisions, by the spring of 1940, 228 German divisions in the East facing the Russians. 228 German divisions facing the Russians. By contrast, there are 58 German divisions in the West, France and Italy. 58 German divisions in the West, France and Italy. And everywhere in the West, the quality of these divisions is mixed, because your best troops are fighting the Russians. So the quality, you have some good units in the West here, but a lot of these are not elite forces. They're not your best forces. They're not your veteran forces. And again, you have many stationary obstacles in the West. You have many heavy guns in the West to fight a naval invasion. Most of these things are not even manned by Germans. Most of these, you have what they called Ost Battalions. Ost, German for East, O-S-T. Ost Battalions. And Ost Battalions, many of these people that are manning these German fortifications are actually Soviet subjects that volunteered to fight with the Germans. Many Soviet subjects that volunteered to fight with the Germans. They did not like the Soviet regime. They did not like Stalin. And so many of them joined the Germans. Some of them had been Soviet POWs that had agreed to, they were starving the Soviet POWs, so they agreed to fight for the Germans in exchange for food. The German 7th Army, one of the formations in France, the German 7th Army, 20% of the manpower of the 7th Army was made up of Ost Battalions. There's also an interesting story. So there's another book I actually nearly assigned you instead of The Storm of War. It was Antony Beevor's book on the Second World War, which is really good too. He starts that book by talking about a Korean. But anyway, this Korean soldier, he is drafted by the Japanese in 1939. And he fights against the Russians at Khalkhin Gol that summer in 1939. He is captured by the Soviets. They put him into a POW camp. When the Germans invade Russia, the Soviets go into their POW camps and they ask for volunteers, park volunteers. He then fights as a Soviet, right? Then he is captured by the Germans who put him into a POW camp, and then he is recruited for an Ost Battalion. And he is serving in France when the American army invades France, and he is captured by the American army. So here you have this Korean who in 1939 is drafted by the Japanese, and he ends his war in a German uniform in France, right? And Beevor used that example to show just truly this was a world war, that it could convey someone like that.